You know we on the spot. I say we on the spot, on the spot, on the spotlight. Yeah.
102.3 KJLH Compton, Los Angeles.
We have a man that you probably know for his work as an actor on television. He is on one of my favorite shows, How to Get Away with Murder. He's on Orange is the New Black. He's done much, much more than that, but he's also an activist. Matt McGorry, welcome to the front page.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for coming in early in the morning to be with us.
The only time I've gotten up slightly earlier than my call times for work. So that's perfect,
right.
though. I have a 7:18 call time to work, but this is perfect. I get a nice head start.
7:18 a.m.
It's very specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, very
so
specific.
You'll know for sure if you're late.
Exactly.
If you're at 7:19, that's
right.
all bad.
I'd lose the job.
Well, you're working a lot. I mean, this is a really competitive business. They call it a tough town, but you stay working.
Yeah.
And you stay conscious. Tell me about your work. You know, how did you get here to LA? Not just here to LA, but here to LA working.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's been a very fortunate journey the last few years. You know, my first television show really was Orange is the New Black, and you know, at the time that I auditioned for that, for all I knew, it was a web series. You know, it was before Netflix had come out with any original content, and before that shift in the way sort of media is being distributed now really happened. So I auditioned for that, and it wasn't really until a season or two in that we found out that it became, you know, the hit that it was. And then How to Get Away with Murder happened, which brought me out here to LA. And, you know, I feel like I've struck lightning twice, you know, and it's a very hard industry, and there's a lot of people that put in a lot of work and that deserve a lot. So I feel grateful to just even be sort of a part of that. And, you know, I think part of that gratitude to me means what can I do with this public platform that I'm afforded.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure I know from looking at your bio that you've done the work too. It's not like you just landed, said, aha, I'm on Netflix. I mean, you've done training, you've done work on stage, you've done comedy, you know, sort of training. Yes,
this is true. I went to Performing Arts High School in New York, and I went to college for theater as well. And yeah, I've been putting in the work, but you know so many people who've also been putting in that work and who also still don't get exactly what they deserve. And so I'm just always conscious of that too. It's, you know, it's a mix of that luck, and, you know, preparation is when, or luck is when preparation meets opportunity, you know, and so I try to be conscious of that too, and just think, man, I put in that work, it's just great, and it's going well, and, you know, hopefully it keeps going.
Yeah. Well, I'm also a theater arts major. We're everywhere.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is, I think what's not spoken about is that there is a tradition of activism in theater, the whole agit-prop tradition, going way, way back. I mean, even back to Shakespeare's time and such, of speaking out in the context of entertainment and making art be an agent for change.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, you know, telling the truth in some ways is one of the primary jobs of an artist of any type. And I think that is important for me in ways that I actually didn't know that it would be sort of many more years ago. My sort of political awakening was only really 3 years ago, after Orange is the New Black. I, you know, credit some of my obliviousness to my privilege and the fact that I did not have to be faced with these things, despite, you know, growing up in New York City. It was not, and it was not necessarily in my face, and it wasn't my experience, so I never had to see it. So it was only really after that I started to really begin to understand how deeply flawed so many aspects of our society and our institutions are in this country, and realized that I essentially, you know, I had to do something about it, right? And there is that long tradition of people telling the truth, and if I'm going to be telling the truth about individual stories, I also have to be telling the truth about the larger systems that influence these stories. You know, and I was on Orange is the New Black for 25 episodes and didn't really fully understand by any means the sort of institutionalized racism in our criminal justice system. And so for me, thinking about that now in hindsight, after having read books like The New Jim Crow, it felt like very much a responsibility of mine to start to kind of call these out and to bring this attention to other people who might have not been aware of this as well, i.e. white people.
It's a powerful book, that book, The New Jim Crow. But a lot of people don't even get to the point of wanting to read it, right? And one of our things on the front page, we say hashtag conscious minds matter, because a lot of it has to do with what you know and what you're exposed to. What would you attribute to you getting woke, so to speak? Yeah,
it it really requires a specific education, and I like to call it a re-education, especially because I think about being white, right, and growing up white, and the fact that I was always enamored with or sort of respected what Dr. King did, but I didn't realize that these things were still happening. And so I had the sort of moral, I think, foundations for what ultimately led me to be someone who decided to take a stand against these issues, but I never actually had the education, right? And that's the way I feel like education is taught in schools, and particularly in schools with predominantly white populations. You're like, oh, the Native Americans, there was a genocide, and then that's it, right? As opposed to understanding that, like, the way that history happens is we are currently creating history as we move through the world. We're creating culture. And I wished that it had been taught in that way, right? That, like, as Michelle Alexander says in The New Jim Crow, these systems of racial control, they morph into new systems. They don't disappear. So for me, that's been a big part of that, is just that re-education process and learning from not necessarily the dominant narratives, but the people, the activists who are at the forefront, who have always been at the forefront of these different issues, forcing the changes in other direction. And I think, the important recognition for me is that all throughout history, people who are the privileged folks have less of a recognition of what is happening. And even, some Gallup studies show that, close to 60% of white people during the sort of peak of the civil rights era did not believe that, or believed that black and white people had equal opportunities. So to me, this tells me that, privilege is just something that is very, it makes people very oblivious. And unless we consciously sort of consider different perspectives and re-educate ourselves, we're never going to really be able to see that and to sort of dismantle these systems.
It's interesting. Just reminded me of an article in the Washington Post, which cited a study that showed that most European Americans or white people think that black people have had their come up already, and that they are much wealthier than they are in terms of averages and medians, not individuals. Yeah. And it speaks to what you're talking about. Okay, we did that. Dr. King, went to the mountaintop, and now we're all good. Right. And, Native Americans came off, indigenous people came off the reservations, now we're all good. So in acknowledging that, I think that is part of the education. At the same time, when you look at the movements for, when you look at what happened in our last election, one of the dividing factors has been education, right? So if you look at Trump voters, most of them did not go to college. And that's, to me, that's really speaks volumes when you talk about, people understanding our country and being able to feel included. It seems like education is a key piece of that. Can you talk a little bit about how you felt in this journey, just in terms of, as you gain more perspective and more education, how does it impact you emotionally or personally in the decisions that you make and the way you look at the world? Right. Yeah. It's been certainly a very unexpected experience for me, again, happening really kind of in the last 3 years. It's been something that I went from not thinking about at all to, now being able to sort of notice everywhere, and I think this is pretty common for a lot of people of color, is that they're able to see these aspects of racism or bias or, sort of these microaggressions in ways that we can't. I think about, like, the movie Get Out, for example, and I imagine seeing that movie 3 years ago and not really understanding some of it, and then seeing it now and saying, oh, wow, that's her white fragility that he's, like, protecting, because she can't handle the fact that, like, maybe she's doing something that is slightly racist, even if she's not, quote, a racist. So for me, it's been, initially it's shocking and it's, it's difficult because you want to do the right thing and you want to believe that having good intentions makes you someone who is, quote unquote, a good person, right? But for me, until I really started to begin to know how much I didn't know, I couldn't really dive in and start to really look
sort of beyond my intentions, understanding that, there's a reason that the saying is the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And unless I'm actually conscious of the social constructs that are acting on me at the time that I'm alive, in the same way that, a lot of white folks look back, they think back to the civil rights era or, the time of American slavery, and we think, man, how could people have let this happen, right? But the truth is that there are versions of this still happening today. And the majority of us do not decide to take a hard stand for it, And so for me, really kind of taking a bigger step back from a more macro view of, okay, what are the things that I'm missing because I've been conditioned this way, right?
Because it's normalized. I mean,
Exactly.
that's the whole conversation about normalizing 45, normalizing the crazy.
Yeah.
When people talk about, Richard Spencer and the Nazis marching again in Charlottesville this weekend, and people now, some news outlets are calling them white activists, that normalizes it, right? So then, of course, you wouldn't speak out because it would be considered the norm.
Absolutely.
So I guess a couple questions around that. Number one, you're talking about how you react to it. I feel like some of those people marching in Charlottesville, part of the reason, and I'm a person that always feels that redemption is always an option. I never feel like there's a lost cause. I'm an optimist, whatever. But I feel like some of those people marching with Spencer feel like, as people of color get more of a voice, as women get more of a voice, that they're going to have less, that they're being pushed out, that they have less opportunity. Have you ever had any, dealing with yourself on that level of going, okay, I'm opening my eyes, I'm going down this path, but am I marginalizing myself?
Yeah, I think that's been I think people obviously scream that a lot. My people, quote unquote, white people. And I think the important consideration is it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not a zero-sum game. There's a lot to go around. There's more than enough to go around, right? We have the ability, for example, to end homelessness. We just don't have the political will to do so. And I think in many areas, the things that were brought up in our culture to want, and look, celebrity culture is a part of this too, are things that are maybe not necessarily good for us to want, right? Like, I actually believe that that being an oppressor is actually dehumanizing to the oppressor as well. Obviously, it's not the same as the marginalization that happens to the people that are oppressed or marginalized, but I believe it's actually bad for us and fundamentally who we are, the same way that I believe being silently complicit in a oppressive society is actually terrible for us too. So that's been interesting even as well as I've spoken out on things and lost, for example, sponsorships and things like that.
You have?
Yes. Yeah. But, and these things that made me like nervous in the beginning and then now sort of realizing, oh, I'm actually doing something that's more important than that, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend that, I have comfort and stability financially, right? I don't need, the extra maybe 25% of my income, right? It's not a necessity. And ultimately, what am I doing? What am I sacrificing if I were to place that above being able to tell the truth and being able to advocate, and be in solidarity with people that are more marginalized than I will never, ever know, right? And if I'm getting to this position in the first place because I have privilege that's been passed down, because my family has come to this country at a time when white people were allowed to come here, and other people were not, and I've been able to intergenerationally benefit from that, from my parents and grandparents benefiting from policies that people of color did not have access to. If I've had that much of a leg up and I still feel like I can't possibly bring myself to tell the truth, I think that's actually harmful to me. And I don't think that I can be the person that I want to be with that. So I think it really is a matter of sort of priorities and ultimately the status quo. I think especially for poor and working class white folks, they would benefit so much if they were able to sort of see beyond kind of the bias and what has sort of been wedged in between them for all of history, from the time that we gave white folks the ability to sort of police, and I mean that quite literally, black folks and runaway slaves. If they were able to sort of see beyond that and to really organize with the other folks that are poor and working class white folks, they'd be able to have a lot greater collective bargaining power. So I think it's not a zero-sum game, and I think that the racism is in place in many ways by, the ruling class to keep people divided.
Yeah, and the whole divide and conquer thing is very active right now. I mean, you see it in so many different areas. I think you see it with men and women in a way. I think you see it with the DACA and the whole immigration piece where I feel like there's a conscious effort to divide African Americans and Latinos.
And even dreamers and non-dreamers,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. We're here already. You're illegal. Go home.
Right.
So I think, and you see that, I'm sure you see it popping up in popular culture, in scripts you read, and things people think is a good idea. We saw the Dove commercial this weekend.
I didn't see that one.
Oh, you're gonna, it's amazing. It's a black woman in a brown shirt. She takes off her shirt, and as the white T-shirt is revealed underneath, her white skin and red hair is revealed underneath, and the implication is that if you use Dove soap, you'll turn white.
No.
So of course they've apologized, but you kind of think, well, who was sitting around a table deciding that was a good idea?
Right.
So I guess the question in all of this is, does this consciousness, do you feel like it informs your work or the decisions you would make about, obviously you've said you've lost sponsors and you've found a way to be okay with that because you know it's a price you're paying for a stance that you're taking. But do you find it's informing your work on a creative level?
I do. I think that it's, again, I've been fortunate enough that as far as like television goes, that I've been on shows that tend to be more progressive, which was actually not necessarily a choice of mine, right? Like at both points in my career when I took these jobs, I was, this was the job that wanted me. And in some ways, I think that, I don't know how much of that was, the quote unquote universe or the fact that, I don't know, maybe I'm a guy that like values my vulnerability and sensitivity, and that inherently makes me somewhat, more suitable in a more progressive show anyway. But, I think going forward also, it's really going to impact it. And, it's hard to find scripts that do not have problematic elements. And that's just sort of the nature of what it is, but I mean, I'm at a place in my life where I don't believe there's such a thing as being apolitical, right? I think that even something that pretends to be apolitical, you're still supporting the status quo, which is already political.
I'm laughing because my father, Mary Baraka, taught me that when I was a little kid. All art is political.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you want to be conscious about what you're saying, or do you just want to say any old thing?
Absolutely, yeah.
And we would go, like, we would see a James Bond movie, and he would sit there and break down what the political messages were.
Absolutely.
I'm 10,
yeah,
12.
That's great.
But it does give you an orientation of understanding that whatever you do says something.
Absolutely.
So one of the things you got involved with was hashtag Men for Choice, right? That was people men tweeting their support for women having their right to make their own decisions. Yeah. How did that come about? It was just something you said, okay, I'll get involved with this. Or,
yeah, I mean, that was sort of, my original introduction to the world of social justice was through, basically through anti-sexism, right? And I say that as opposed to feminism now because I realize that, if feminism is not explicitly anti-racist, then it is just anti-sexism, and it's not actually feminism for people of all genders, right? And different experiences based on marginalization based on, income levels and ability and all this other stuff. So anti-sexism was sort of my initial sort of journey into social justice work. And, this was one of these areas where, people were really, I began to really start to think outside my own perspective about these things that I never had to think about, that I had the privilege to be essentially unaware of. And that was an initial thing where I came out with a T-shirt. It was like 2 years ago. And this is one of the lessons that I've learned as well, is like I came out with the T-shirt on International Women's Day, but I think that I know now that I would not do that again, because that's not really a day for me. And I think taking up space in that sort of world is actually a bit of a mistake, despite me, again, understanding my good intentions with that. But anyway, I came out with a shirt, and we donated the profits. We raised like $15,000 for NARAL, which is a pro-choice advocacy group. But it's important, it's important because this issue, it affects all of us, right? And again, we can't let women fight these issues on their own. What does that mean? Why? I think it's important for us as men and white people in terms of racial justice, like to really look deep and say, why are we okay with being so complacent about this? What is the limitation in our empathy that allows us to not feel like, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, because I really believe that that's what it is. So, and that was one of the sort of areas that I was focusing in on as well. And it obviously is such an important thing right now too, when the current administration is so directly targeting, obviously, every marginalized community.
Yeah. But last week it's okay, we're going to take away your access to birth control.
Yeah.
We don't have time to help Puerto Rico, but we have time to take away your access to birth control.
Absolutely.
Just incredible. But the good news is people are pushing back. I think they really are fighting back. You're also part of supporting white people for Black Lives. So I want to talk more about that. But just in putting together this conversation about you're supporting anti-sexism and supporting Black Lives Matter, do you have white friends and family members that go, Matt McGorry, what are you doing? Do you hate white people? Are you doing an apology tour? What are you doing?
Yeah, no, I've been very fortunate, and I don't think it's an accident either, that, like I have these conversations with my parents who are still expressing that they're learning from me. And I think that it's not an accident that I was raised by people that are capable of like critically assessing and like learning new things, that I've also been capable of like gaining that knowledge very quickly. And so I think that, I'm very fortunate in that way, and I think my friends, my closest friends have always been people that have valued things like integrity, right? And like, how do we be a good person? And like, critical thinking about philosophy and sociology. So the people I've been very fortunate that the people I've, expressed these issues to, they at least haven't like ostracized me, and I will say that there is, being a white anti-racist person is difficult. It's not as difficult as being a person of color that's an anti-racist, but it does come with its own difficulties, right? Because a lot of times we exist in these circles that are primarily white folks, and there is a fear. And I have had the fear with most of my white friends, that even my best friends, who now we've seen the other side of it, that perhaps this is not going to, we're not going to see through our way through this, right? And my friends that are men too, right? And talking, really expressing that, like, I'm not really comfortable with us talking about women that way, or these sort of subtle microaggressions that I never really had seen before, that I could now see were being oppressive, and I was having to express the need to sort of shift these dynamics, right? So I've been very fortunate that that has been the case for me, but I think also, groups, so for example, White People for Black Lives, while we act, primarily in solidarity with our solidarity partners like Black Lives Matter LA, it is also, we realize that the white community has work to do as well, right? And people of color should not always have to be the ones to teach us about this stuff, when we can really, take a lead on developing that ourselves. And the racism exists in the white community. The racism that keeps people of color marginalized exists in the white community. So part of this is about really organizing ourselves, and also finding solidarity in other people that are going through very specific experiences that I might be going to, right? Like if my white, uncle or someone is, resistant, like I do need to be able to talk about this, but it's not necessarily appropriate for me to go to my friend of color and be like, hey, it's so hard for me that my uncle is racist, right? But you do need other folks to be able to talk that through. And then we can come back in cohort in the multiracial spaces and actually be better, more well-equipped to have these conversations in productive ways, and to sort of challenge these institutional systems.
Okay, up against the clock here. We have some friends we want to bring in with you this morning, and also want to talk about this event, White People for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter getting together. It sounds like an incredible piece. Got to ask you this, though. How does that happen? When a sponsor says, we're not going to have Matt McGorry representing us anymore, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think the thing is, you notice in the very beginning, right, like the biggest sort of sponsorship thing that I lost was actually when I came out with that T-shirt. And that was, look, I was still doing my day job the entire time I was on Orange Is the New Black. So again, this is not me saying like, oh, I have it so hard, but I'm also not the guy that's got like $1 million or multiple millions of dollars or whatever. Again, not me asking for a plea of sympathy. But this was, a bigger sponsorship that would have been equivalent to probably like half the year's work on the show. Wow. And we were sort of in the final stages, and then they basically decided to, quote unquote, go another direction. And then after that, just over time, essentially, the people stopped reaching out, right? So they're not going to say, oh, we would have considered him, except, he's a little too political for us.
Yeah.
But in some ways, I think ripping the Band-Aid off has been kind of nice too, because now I don't have to, I've kind of drawn this hard line of accountability for myself, and I don't have to necessarily tiptoe around as well, because, if once you've lost all the sponsorships, you have nothing to lose in a way, or in that capacity.
In that way, right?
Yeah.
What can you be swayed with? At that
Yeah,
point?
exactly. How much is your silence worth, essentially?
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the meme, right? We on the black team would like to trade Ray Lewis for Matt McGorry.
I'm not sure if I've seen that particular one.
Pretty funny. All right, it's the front page. We've got information coming up. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, Black Lives Matter, White People for Black Lives, an incredible lineup of actors and activists coming together, right? And it's coming up.
For me, a big part of re-educating myself that we were talking about has been reading, for example, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And this is a
great book.
And this follows in suit of that, right? To really put the focus on these sort of quote unquote ordinary people that have been struggling for justice all along, who are, whose history is mostly ignored.
Fat book, but worth a read for sure.
Absolutely.
It's the front page. More straight ahead. It's Radio Free 102.3 KJLH and KJLHradio.com.
KJLHradio.com.
We on the spot.